Welcome to episode 154 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about Charles Mingus's mammoth achievement from 1963, The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady on Impulse. And what I have here is a 1964 Japanese, so I guess it's the first Japanese pressing. It's kind of sad not to have the nice original US gatefold cover, but I do have the intrigue of having a beautiful flip back cover covered in Japanese, including, I assume, the liner notes, which were written by his therapist, translated into Japanese, and it's just something pleasurable about that thought. Anyway, this is a wild, brilliant album from maybe the wildest, most brilliant mind in all of jazz. But Mingus's mind, of course, was also troubled. He struggled with mental health issues, with anger issues, with his rage at the structural inequality and racism of American society. Musically, like both of the Coltranes, like Pharoah Sanders, like Archie Shepp, like a whole bunch of other real geniuses within the world of jazz, Mingus is an acquired taste, and that's very much true of this record. Charles Mingus is born in Arizona in 1922, and he grows up in the Watts area of LA. He played a variety of different instruments growing up, and he's eventually taught the double bass by a guy called Red Callender, who was a jazz musician who would subsequently go on to be part of the famous wrecking crew of soul and pop session guys in LA in the 1960s. As a young musician, Mingus was also tutored by a guy who played double bass with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, a guy called Herman Reinshagen. And not only was he always influenced by classical music in his own compositions, he hated to be pigeonholed as a jazz musician. That was something he would struggle with, and really when you listen to this, you can understand why. And he himself felt that he was often pigeonholed as a jazz musician because he was black. Mingus had a huge musical brain, and things came easily to him that didn't come so easily to other people. For instance, he became quite well known for being able to improvise against the melody as opposed to riffing on different motifs within it. He's also widely considered to have moved the double bass on as an instrument from its pre-war days of basically being a timekeeping device within the big bands to his compositional work after the war, which in the words of the dude really kind of used the instrument to tie the whole room together. Although he knew and played with almost all of the big names of mid-century American jazz, he was a real iconoclast. He wasn't really part of a lot of those movements. He resisted bebop. He wasn't part of Miles's group of late 40s hard bop deviants and cool jazz wizards. For a long time in the late 40s and the early 1950s, he actually resisted the urge to move away from swing itself. But then in 1951, an encounter with the cold hard facts of racism caused him to take a different direction. In New York in 1951, he was playing in a trio with the vibraphonist Red Norvo and the guitarist Tal Farlow, and they had a TV appearance coming up, but it fell to Norvo to tell Mingus that he'd been informed that Mingus would not be allowed to be part of the broadcast because he was black. This happens around the same time that Bob Weinstock, who was a senior executive with Prestige Records, which was pretty much the biggest jazz label at the time, told Mingus that he'd like him to cut a record and he was willing to pay him $10, a free lunch, and give him a line of coke. Mingus is outraged and insulted by these slights and other incidents around this time, and he decides to make a break with the white musical establishment that was controlling black music as he saw it. And so with his wife at the time and Max Roach, the well-known drummer, he formed his own record label, Debut Records. Easily the most famous release of Debut Records is a concert in 1953, which Mingus participated in, and which included a number of the most famous names in bebop history. Although he did some small group work, Mingus's real passion was actually for bigger ensembles. He looked at the current jazz scene in the 1950s. He wanted it to be something different. He didn't want songs simply just to be platforms for solos. He wanted there to be collective expression as well as individual virtuosity. And so the larger collectives, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11 players, was his chosen form of composition. But where other larger bands at the time were tightly scripted and composed and arranged, Mingus was quite prepared to allow all kinds of chaos to develop during the recording process. And if you listen to his recordings, it always seems as if the band is just teetering on the edge of chaos, and you can hear Mingus shouting at the band members during the performance and all the rest of it. All very typical of him. It was just that teetering on the edge where the greatest creativity he felt came out. In 1956, he releases Pithecanthropus erectus, on which his compositions deviated quite substantially at points from the established structures and cliches of contemporary jazz. He didn't get a ton of credit for that, not nearly as much credit as Miles Davis would get on Kinda Blue for doing a very similar kind of thing 3 years later, which totally pissed Mingus off. Mind you, it wasn't that hard to piss Mingus off. He had a track record for shouting at audiences in nightclubs because they were laughing and clinking glasses during performances. Famously, he once assaulted one of his trombonists and punched him in the face, breaking his teeth and ruining his embouchure, which is a big deal if you're a musician. Anyway, the guy sues, and Mingus, once the lawsuit came in, sent the guy an anonymous letter with an ounce of heroin in it and then called the cops on him. By 1963, having churned through several different recording contracts, Mingus moves to Impulse. That year, he releases 3 remarkable albums: Black Saint, Mingus plays piano, and Mingus, 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 Mingus. It was an incredible flourishing, but then sadly he begins to go downhill. The first glimmers of this happened when after this record came out, the sales weren't as good as the quality of the music would suggest they should have been, and Bob Thiel, who was his producer and also one of the major execs at Impulse, wouldn't give Mingus a raise. Thiel comes into his office one day to find a note stuck onto his desk chair with a knife. The note saying simply, "Where the fuck is my money? Mingus." The rest of his career had real highlights, but unfortunately it was also punctuated by poor physical health and poor mental health. Here, however, he's at the peak of his powers, harnessing his demons, but also exploiting them to the fullest. This album was recorded on January 20th, 1963. The producer is Bob Thiel. Immediately prior to the recording date, Mingus had a 6-week run at the Village Vanguard. He brought Bob Hammond and his band in, and Hammond and Mingus, between them, over the course of that 6 weeks, figured out how to orchestrate The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, this piece which Mingus had been working on for some time. When they were ready, they went to the studio. The lineup is Mingus on double bass and piano, Jerome Richardson on soprano and baritone sax, Charlie Mariano on alto sax, and Dick Hafer on tenor sax, Rolf Erickson and Richard Williams on trumpet, Quentin Jackson on trombone, Don Butterfield on tuba and contrabass trombone, Jackie Bayard on piano, Jay Berliner on classical guitar, and Danny Richmond on drums. The album itself has 4 different tracks, most of which is written theoretically as part of a ballet. Side 2 is completely taken up with the 4th track, which is divided into 4 different movements. While there are different elements to the different movements and tracks, this is very much an integral, organic composition as a whole. It's characterized by all sorts of bent notes, by this vampy horn playing. There's a very bluesy feeling to a lot of the music. There's a very New Orleans-y feeling at different times. There are elements of different cultures which creep in here and there, and constant changes in tempo and mood. Side 1 starts with Solo Dancer, which has this sort of foreboding rhythm which makes me think a little bit of a Tennessee Williams play. Mingus from the start is urging the band forward. There's the first of this repeated motif of undulating sound, of heaving seas, of racing and then receding. Technically, this is beautifully engineered, and the soundstage is just incredible. There's so much clarity to all of the 11 instruments, you can easily pick out all the different elements. The next track is Duet Solo Dancers, which starts with this lovely piano intro. I'm not sure if it's Bayard or if it's Mingus, but the assertiveness of it makes me think it's probably Mingus. Parts of this track are kind of vampy and then move on to suggest a kind of sentimental dance music of people like Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman, but the Nightmare version, the Tim Burton version if you want. Rhythms appearing and disappearing, and then you have this muted trumpet, kind of wild, really effectively mimicking the human voice, quite unsettlingly. Side 1 concludes with Group Dancers, which again begins with a piano figure, very much suggesting sort of uncertain, tentative movements. Then there's one of a few Spanish-sounding passages with an alto sax, guitar, and a flute. The only thing constant about this composition is change, and you also get little elements of the blues creeping in here and there, and then the side ends with a solo flourish from an alto sax. Side 2 has the last of the 4 tracks, and this of course has 3 different movements. Side begins with an echo of some of the motifs from the first side and a bass figure from Mingus, and then you get this lovely classical guitar solo and some horns added in. To me, at points, this track sounds a lot like Sketches of Spain, Miles Davis's album with Gil Evans from a few years before. The central movement, single solos and group dance, once again has different instruments playing with different motifs, and in particular there's a passage with the flutes that goes da 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 da, which is one of the biggest earworms of the whole composition. My notes from this movement include things like feels like a New Orleans funeral march, only sexed up, chaos erupts, order is so fleeting, rhythm lurches faster and slower, and my last note here is this is one fucking subversive record for a record with no words. All of these tendencies, the lurching back and forth in rhythm and tempo and in intensity, seem to come to a head in the final movement. It's almost as if Mingus is trying to get every single idea in his head out into the air while there's still time to do it. And then you get a final note in alto and that sees us out. And all I have to say is phew after that. Whatever this is, it's not dinner music. It's spectacular, it's unsettling. Not only does it require your full attention, it demands your full attention. As I said earlier, this is an album which probably will take some time to grow on you. These days, I know a little bit more about jazz, and I thought a little bit more about composing and arranging, and the challenge of doing that, and the challenge of working with human beings in an orchestrated setting than I knew before. And one becomes increasingly impressed and wowed by the ambition of the composition, but also the willingness to let go of the reins, which Mingus shows routinely on this, and once again, to teeter on the edge of chaos, but thrillingly so. This isn't just a great jazz record, it's an essential and unique piece of 20th century music overall, and it's clearly a 5 out of 5.